Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're unearthing a truly fascinating and surprisingly persistent human belief. It's something that reaches back millennia. Our source for this exploration is very specific and incredibly insightful. Part 3, Chapter 9 of Sir James George Frazer's huge work, Folklore in the Old Testament. Now, when you hear folklore in the Old Testament, you might think of, grand sagas, heroes, maybe mythical beasts. But Frazer, he zooms in on something much more subtle, something deeply ingrained. This peculiar idea why counting things, especially people, was, and sometimes still is, considered really unlucky, even a sin.
That's exactly right. Frazer's chapter is called The Sin of a Census, and it really dives deep into this specific aversion. We'll start with a pretty well-known biblical story and then kind of pan out to see just how common this belief actually is across different cultures and, how it connects to worldviews and ideas about unseen forces.
So what's the takeaway for us? Living today, surrounded by data, metrics, everything's counted. Well, get ready maybe to rethink the simple act of counting. We're about to see how something we barely think about could once supposedly trigger disaster. Let's explore.
Okay, the story of King David's census. This is where Frazer really starts to unspool this whole thing. He uses the books of Samuel and Chronicles. So what happens there? Why is it so central?
Well, the biblical account is pretty stark, actually. King David gets this idea. The text isn't totally clear if it's from God or Satan, interestingly enough, to count his people, to number Israel and Judah. And the result? Immediate, catastrophic. A huge pestilence sweeps through the land.
Wow.
Yeah. And popular belief at the time was clear. This disaster was God's punishment, retribution for the census itself.
A direct cause and effect then. Count the people, disaster follows. And it gets pretty vivid, doesn't it? I mean, the scripture describes people seeing the destroying angel over Jerusalem, sword drawn. Incredibly vivid, almost terrifying. Frazer actually draws a parallel there to Defoe's description of the plague in London, where people imagine seeing similar apparitions. And the story only ends when David, full of remorse, confesses his sin, builds an altar, offers sacrifices. Only then does the angel withdraw his sword.
So it begs the question Frazer asks, why? Why this intense, almost visceral reaction to just numbering people? What's the underlying fear?
Exactly. And that's where Frazer really broadens the lens. He argues that this Jewish aversion isn't like some unique anomaly. He proposes it's actually a specific example of a much more general, almost universal feeling. A reluctance, particularly among, well, what he terms ignorant people, but really just traditional societies maybe. A reluctance to allow themselves, their animals, their important possessions, to be precisely counted.
So not just a biblical thing, but a human thing.
Pretty much. Frazer frames it as a widespread superstition. And if you connect the dots across cultures, the core fear often seems to be this. Counting draws attention, specifically the wrong kind of attention.
Like from evil spirits or maybe jealous gods?
Precisely. Making the counted individuals or items vulnerable. It's like you're handing over a list to forces that might wish you harm. Don't give them the exact coordinates, so to speak. But Frazer also hints at something maybe deeper, psychologically. The act of counting. It turns living, dynamic things into static numbers. It almost feels like you're limiting their potential, fixing their fate, making them too known.
Interesting. Like taking the mystery or maybe the potential for growth out of it?
Sort of, yeah. Leaving no room for change, or perhaps for divine protection which thrives in the slightly unknown.
Okay, so Frazer doesn't just theorize this, right? He backs it up with examples from all over. Where does he take us first? I think Africa features heavily.
It does. He starts in the lower Congo with the Bakongo people. For a woman to count her own children was considered extremely unlucky. The fear was direct. Evil spirits would hear the number, target them, and some would die.
Wow, just counting your kids.
Yeah. And the people themselves hated being counted for the same reason. Frazer even notes this specific instance in 1908, where Belgian Congo officials faced real resistance trying to conduct a census for taxes.
And it wasn't about the tax itself.
No. Frazer says the resistance wasn't primarily the tax, but the act of being counted. The fear it would lead to death. That's quite profound.
Definitely. What about other groups?
Well, upriver, the Balochi, or Bangala, had a similar strong prejudice against counting children. They believed it would cause them to die. So if asked, they might say something wild like, oh, I have 60 children or 100.
That's a way to deliberately mislead any listening spirits.
Exactly. A clever deception. Then you have the Maasai in East Africa. They wouldn't count their warriors or their cattle.
To believe.
Believe it would cause death. They talk about large numbers. but only in vague, round figures. Only the dead were counted precisely.
Only the dead, that's telling. And cattle were often central to this, right? Their wealth, livelihood.
Absolutely. For the Akamba, also in East Africa, cattle are everything, and they never counted their herds. It was believed to bring general misfortune, applying to all living things, but maybe especially cattle, and interestingly, girls.
Girls, specifically.
Yeah. Though Frazer notes a conflicting account where some Akamba apparently didn't have this superstition about stock and knew their children's numbers, but just wouldn't tell outsiders. So maybe some internal variation or secrecy involved.
Right, traditions aren't always monolithic.
True. There's also a story about an Akamba man, Munda Wangola, who boasted about his large family, only for them all to be killed by Maasai raiders. This was seen as like a judgment for his boasting, implicitly linked to revealing the number.
Fascinating. And the Kikuyu.
The Akikuju found it really tactless, very unlucky, to ask a mother how many children she had. Echoes of the Old Testament story, Frazer says. The polite way to deflect was just, come and see for yourself.
The practical evasion.
Right. Though interestingly, Kikuyu boys, who had more contact with outsiders, apparently lost this aversion. And the Galas, also East Africa, considered counting cattle an evil omen because they thought it stopped the herd from increasing.
So we've got fear of death, fear of misfortune, fear of stopping growth. Did he find this outside Africa too?
Oh, yes. Among the Hottentots in southern Africa, counting community members was believed to cause death. There's this grim story, maybe apocryphal, of a missionary who counted his workers without knowing the taboo and supposedly died soon after for his mistake.
Yikes. A stark warning.
And it was widespread in North Africa too, Algeria especially. Native opposition to French census efforts was largely driven by this fear. It even extended to counting measures of grain. Grain often had a sacred quality.
Counting grain? How did they even manage trade or storage?
Very carefully. At Oran, for instance, the person counting grain had to be ritually pure. Instead of saying 1, 2, 3, they used special phrases.
Like code.
Exactly. Like, in the name of God for 1, 2 blessings for 2, hospitality of the prophet for 3. And get this, for 5, they'd say, in the eye of the devil.
In the eye of the devil for 5. That is quite something. Why 5?
It seems 5 was often considered an unlucky or potent number. In Palestine, Muslims counting grain would say God is 1, then he has no second. They'd actively avoid certain numbers, 5, 7, 9, 11. For 5, they might gesture and say, your hand, referring to the fingers.
Ah, using a symbol instead of the word.
Right. 7 might be passed over in silence or called a blessing. 9 might be pray in the name of Muhammad. 11 often just skipped, jumping from 10 to 12. The whole point was to confuse or deceive any listening evil spirits.
The level of elaboration is incredible. It really shows how seriously they took this. Where else did Frazer find this?
He jumps to the Pacific. In the Shortlands group, near the Solomon Islands, builders working on a chief's house wouldn't count the palm leaves needed for the thatch. It was unlucky.
But what if they miscalculated?
Apparently, even if it meant abandoning a nearly finished house because they ran short of leaves, they still wouldn't count them beforehand. That's a pretty significant sacrifice.
Huge. What about the Americas?
Among the Cherokee, you weren't supposed to count melons or squash while they were growing, or even look at them too closely. The fear was they'd just stop thriving.
Stop thriving.
Yeah.
Again, that link to growth and vitality.
Exactly. And in British Columbia, after an official took a census of the First Nations people at Fort Simpson, a measles outbreak happened. The local people directly blamed the numbering for the disease.
Oh, wow. A direct modern-day echo of the David story, almost.
Pretty much. And the Omaha people, they didn't record ages. They feared that numbering their years would bring about some kind of evil.
So this isn't just ancient history or something confined to, faraway tribal societies. Did Frazer find traces closer to home? In Europe?
Absolutely. He brings it right into Europe, even into relatively recent times. The Lapps, for example, were apparently very unwilling to count themselves, fearing it would increase mortality.
Still. Even in Frazer's time.
He suggests it persisted, yes. And in Highlands of Scotland, counting people or cattle was considered unlucky, especially on a Friday. Cowherds knew their animals by sight, by markings, not by a total head count.
And fishermen. I feel like fishermen are often superstitious.
Definitely. Scottish fishermen wouldn't reveal how many fish they'd caught, bad for future luck. In Shetland, it was bad luck to count anything valuable: sheep, cattle, horses, fish. There was even a belief there that smallpox outbreaks had followed a census.
Smallpox. So again, that direct link to plague or disease.
Yes. And on the northeast coast of Scotland, Fisher folk wouldn't count the boats out at sea, or even just gatherings of people on the shore. Frazer mentions specific rhymes that mischievous kids would chant at fishwives, deliberately counting them just to annoy them, knowing it was taboo.
So it permeated everyday life, not just official counts.
Right down to the local level. In Lincolnshire, England, farmers avoided counting their lambs too closely. The idea was it gave powers of evil too much information. There's that French saying, too. Brebis comptes, le loup les mange. Counted sheep, the wolf eats them.
The wolf eats them. Straightforward.
And this fear extended to people's ages. Instead of giving a number, some folks in parts of Europe might say something like, I'm as old as my tongue and a little bit older than my teeth.
Huh. That's a classic folk saying, isn't it?
It is. Or in Hainault, Belgium, they might reply, I am the age of a calf every year 12 months. Clever ways to avoid the number. Frazer even mentions a friend in South Warwickshire who observed a postmaster's wife, otherwise perfectly modern, who refused to count her lambs. His friend's comment was simply, superstitions die hard.
It really shows the persistence, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Any other surprising European examples?
Quite a few. In Denmark, you shouldn't count eggs under a brooding hen. The belief was the mother would step on them. Don't count the hatched chickens either, or birds of prey would get them.
So it affects animal behavior too, supposedly.
And plants. Counting blossoms or fruit would make them wither or fall off early. And interestingly, counting things you don't want, like mice or vermin, was thought to make them increase.
Oh, so the opposite effect. That's a twist.
Yeah, or counting warts in Greece and Armenia believed to make more appear. Conversely, in Germany, a popular belief was that counting your money too often would make it decrease.
Okay, maybe there's something to that one.
Maybe. And in Bavaria, loaves baking in the oven shouldn't be counted, or they wouldn't bake properly. And dumplings weren't counted, out of a rather charming fear that the little woodwomen nature spirits who loved dumplings would perish if their treats were numbered, and then the forest itself would die.
Wow, from personal misfortune to ecological collapse, all from counting dumplings.
It covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
And similarly, in northeast Scotland, bread cakes baked on the griddle weren't counted, or the fairies would eat them.
Okay, so after this incredible global tour of counting taboos, what's Frazer's big takeaway? How does he tie it all together?
Well, he circles back to the beginning, to King David. He concludes that the original Jewish objection to the census probably was rooted in, quote, sheer superstition, a fundamental, perhaps ancient fear. And the plague that followed, that would have just cemented the belief, confirmed the danger in their minds. He notes that this deep-seated reluctance to count things, tents, horsemen, cattle, still lingered among Arabs in Syria in his own time for fear of misfortune.
So a basic human fear, maybe amplified by a memorable disaster, that then gets embedded in culture.
That seems to be his main thrust. It's about perceived cause and effect in a world that often feels unpredictable. Attributing disaster to a specific, avoidable act like counting gives a semblance of control, maybe.
Right, but that raises a practical question. If counting was so taboo, so sinful, how did the ancient Jewish society eventually manage things like, well, taxes or organizing an army? Did they just never count?
That's a crucial point Frazer addresses. The answer is they adapted. Later on, the prohibition wasn't absolute. The Jewish law, as recorded later, actually allowed for a census.
It did, so they got over the fear.
Not exactly. It was permitted, but only under a very specific condition. Every man who was counted had to pay a fee, half a shekel, directly to the Lord. This was explicitly called a ransom for his life.
A ransom?
Yes, a ransom, specifically to prevent a plague from breaking out when the people were numbered.
So you could count, but you had to pay protection money, essentially, to God.
That's basically it. A symbolic payment to appease the deity, to neutralize the potential danger of the count itself. Frazer puts it nicely.
Yeah.
It was assumed that God, upon receiving this moderate fee, would waive his scruples about the census.
That's fascinating. It acknowledges the deep-seated fear, but finds a ritualistic workaround for practical needs.
Precisely. It shows just how ingrained that fear was, that even when they needed to count, they built in this mechanism, this spiritual insurance policy. It didn't erase the superstition, but it managed it.
What an incredible journey through such a specific yet widespread human belief. From King David's plague to, not counting cattle in Africa or dumplings in Bavaria, it really shows that counting wasn't always just simple arithmetic.
Not at all. It was loaded with meaning, tied into ideas about fate, spirits, vulnerability, and the very essence of life and growth. Trying to avoid attracting negative attention, maybe trying to keep things a little bit mysterious, a little bit protected from being too defined, too known.
It really highlights how these fundamental beliefs, even ones we might call superstitious today, can shape behavior across incredibly diverse cultures and persist for centuries, adapting in really clever ways, like that ransom payment.
Absolutely. It speaks volumes about the human need to find patterns, to feel some control, or at least to negotiate with the forces we believe govern the world, seen and unseen.
So maybe something for you to think about. Next time you're doing your taxes or counting birthday candles or even just tallying followers online, pause for a second. Are you just dealing with numbers? Or are you, maybe unconsciously, echoing this ancient global conversation about risk, fate, and what happens when we try to quantify the unquantifiable? You might just find a little flicker of ancient folklore hiding in our modern obsession with data.